The next budget that we have to make is our ending inventories budget, and this is useful for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it's going to give us our ending finished goods inventory, which means that's in our ending direct materials inventory. That's the amounts that we're going to be able to report for our inventory accounts on our budgeted balance sheet. But also with our ending finished goods inventory, it's going to allow us to know what portion of the cost of units that we produced is still being contained in units we have not sold, which is going to help us prepare our cost of goods sold budget and ultimately give us the figures that we need for all sorts of measures of income. So the first thing we're going to do on our ending inventories budget is our direct materials, and this is the easiest part to go through. Quantity of plastic and metal expected to be on hand at the end of the period was set as a target way back in our info. We said, if I can switch to the thing, that at period's end, our desired ending inventory for direct materials was 410 pounds of plastic and 65 pounds of metal. So I can go and I can grab those numbers and I can bring them right over into our calculations. We have 410 and we have 65. What do those cost? Well, that depends on what cost flow assumption you are choosing for your business. And we have information right here that says Animal Gear is a FIFO company, which means that those 290 pounds of plastic and 70 pounds of metal that we had in beginning inventory, they're long gone. Like, we used way more than that in production. We know that from our direct materials usage budget. We used way more than that. Since we're FIFO, we assume that everything from beginning inventory gets used first, and what we have left at the end of the period are the last units that we purchased, which means we're going to operate under the assumption that all 410 pounds of plastic and 65 pounds of metal were purchased during this month of April 20XX, which is pertinent because we have our expected price to buy each pound of these according to our purchasing manager. So we can assume here on our ending inventory budget that the 410 pounds of plastic, which we have in ending inventory when the period ends, were purchased this period when plastic cost $5 a pound. We can assume, because we're a FIFO company, that the 65 pounds of metal we have in ending inventory cost what we paid for metal per pound this period, which was $4, which means those 410 pounds of plastic that we have in ending direct materials inventory cost a total of $2,050. Those 65 pounds of metal which we have in ending inventory cost $4 a piece, which means the total cost of metal we have in ending inventory is $260. And in total, we're going to value our ending direct materials inventory at $2,310. We don't want to have just ending, raw materials sitting around. We also want to have some ending finished goods inventory. We want to have some units in inventory at the end of the period which are finished and ready to go. And that information has already been given to us as well, that it is the desire of our company to finish this period with 30 finished Cadillacs in ending inventory and 10 finished Doggerifics in our ending inventory. So I can go and I can bring those numbers over to my EI, or ending inventory budget, if you will. We're going to have 30 Cadillacs according to our info, and we're going to have 10 Doggerifics. Well, let's just multiply that by the unit cost, how much it costs us to produce one Cadillac and one Doggerific during the period. And this is where we hit the snag, because we don't have that number right now. We need to figure out what our unit cost is for each unit that we have in ending finished goods inventory. Well, we can start with the cost per unit. That isn't so bad. Plastic, we already have. We know that each unit of plastic that went into finished goods at the end of the period cost $5 a piece. We know that each pound of metal that went in to our units in ending finished goods inventory cost 4 pounds a piece. We know that when our laborers worked on jobs during the period, we got a direct labor budget, that they made $10 per hour, which means each one of those units that are in ending finished goods inventory, the labor component of producing those would have been inventoried at a rate of $10 per hour. And then for our three activities, well, they all had a predetermined allocation rate for that activity. It was 105 for setups, 10 for processing, and 15 for inspection. So we can bring those over as our cost per input unit. 105 for machine setups, 10 for processing, and 15 for inspection. Now we have to have our input per unit of output. How much of that input, these things over here, went into making one Cadillac? Well, we have all of that information as well, way back in our info. Each Cadillac takes 4 pounds of plastic, half pound of metal, and 3 hours of direct labor. Let's go and fill those numbers in. For plastic, the input per unit of output for Cadillac was 4 for plastic, was a half pound for metal, and it took 3 labor hours to produce each one of those Cadillacs that were in ending inventory. For machine setup, though, we got a little bit of calculations to do, because our machine setup over here, way back on our manufacturing overhead budget, is in terms of batches. We know how many setup hours that it takes. We know that, we have this amount of cost going in there. Well, we don't need to figure out how long it takes to set up a batch. We need to figure out how long it took to set up at a prorated amount for one unit. And we can do that by taking, I'll put it over here, our total activity time, or total setup time, and dividing that by the number of units that we produced. And our information on our manufacturing overhead budget, where these are all coming from, says that it's going to take us 33 hours to produce 550 units. So if I divide 33 by 550, I get 0.06. It takes about 0.06 hours to set up to make one unit. For processing, that is how long, how many units of that driver we're using for each unit that we make. Well, that information was actually given to us. We had up here that the machine hours it takes to machine or process one Cadillac was 11. So I can just go and I can bring that number over to our budget. And then inspection. How long does it take on average to inspect any one given Cadillac in ending inventory? Let's go to manufacturing overhead budget and figure out what we're working with here. Our manufacturing overhead rate is per batch. We know how many hours it takes to make each batch. We know how many hours it's going to take to inspect all of the Cadillacs that we produce in total. Well, let's work with that. If we know how long it takes to inspect every single Cadillac that we produce during the period, if we take our total inspection time, divide it by how many units we need to inspect, it gives us our average amount of time it takes to inspect any one given unit. So here we can do total inspection time divided by the number of units that we produced. So our total inspection time for the Cadillac was 11 hours. We produced 550 of those, so if we take 11 and divide it by 550, we get 0.02. It takes about 0.02 hours to inspect one Cadillac. And now we can figure out the cost inputs that go into each unit. And we get that by taking our cost per input unit, and then how many of those input units, in this case how many pounds of plastic, go into one unit of output, one piece of finished goods. At a rate of $5 per pound, and knowing that each one took 4 pounds, each Cadillac cost us $20 in plastic to make. At a rate of $4 per pound for metal, and knowing each one took a half pound of metal, each Cadillac we produced cost us $2 in metal to produce. at a rate of $10 per hour and a requirement of 3 labor hours for each Cadillac we produce. That means that each Cadillac costs us $30 in labor costs. At a rate of $105 per machine setup hour and a rate of 0.06 setup hours to set up for one given Cadillac. That means that each Cadillac is causing us to incur $6.30 worth of overhead cost for setting up at a rate of $10 per machine hour for processing, and a requirement of taking 11 hours to machine a Cadillac. That is $110 worth of machining indirect costs or machining overhead that we're going to incur for each Cadillac that we make. And then for inspecting, we're paying our inspector $15 an hour. It takes them 0.02 hours to inspect any one given Cadillac. That's a total of 30 cents. Big whopping 30 cents worth of inspection costs that we have per unit. So how much did each Cadillac that we have in finished goods cost Animal Gear Company to produce? We just find the sum of all of these numbers. Equals the sum, highlight all the stuff, close your parenthesis. That is $168.60. Those 30 Cadillacs that we have in ending finished goods inventory cost us a unit cost of $168.60 a piece. Which means in total, those 30 Cadillacs in ending finished goods inventory, if I multiply that by the unit cost us a total of $5,058 to produce. And that's what they'll be inventoried for when they're sitting in our ending finished goods inventory. Let's do the same thing for Doggerific. How many inputs per unit of output do we need? For plastic, that means how many pounds of plastic goes into one Doggerific. Well, again, we can go back to our info and see that each Doggerific takes 6 pounds of plastic. Input per unit of output for metal. How many pounds of metal does each Doggerific take? It takes 1 pound of metal. How many labor hours does it take to put together a Doggerific? Our information tells us that we're going with a standard of 5 labor hours per each Doggerific that we produce. And I'm even going to skip down here. For processing, our standard says it takes 19 machine hours to produce a Doggerific, which means now we just got to fill in how long it takes to set up for one Doggerific if we prorate out our total setup time, and how long it takes to inspect any one given Doggerific. And we're going to use the same methodology that we used earlier. What is the total setup time for Doggerifics? How many Doggerifics are we making? Because if we take that total setup time and divide it by the number of units that we're going to produce, we get how long we take to set up for one Doggerific. If I go back to my manufacturing overhead budget, we're making 216 Doggerifics. They're going to require us to spend a big whopping 42 hours to set up. So we take 42 and divide it by 216. We come up with 0.19. It takes 0.19 hours to set up for a Doggerific. What about inspection? We'll take our total inspection time, the total inspection hours for that particular product line, divide by how many of them we're going to make, and that gives us, on average, how long it takes to inspect a Doggerific. So we go back to our manufacturing overhead budget. We're going to spend 16.8 hours in total inspecting 216 Doggerifics. So if I take 16.8 and divide it by 216, I come up with 0.08. It takes about 0.08 hours to inspect a Doggerific. And then, now that I have our input per unit of output, I can just multiply that like I did before by our cost per input unit. So if we're going to pay $5 a pound for plastic, and each Doggerific requires 6 pounds of plastic, that means we're going to spend $30 in plastic to make a Doggerific. And each unit we have in ending finished goods inventory, part of its cost is going to be the $30 we spent in plastic to finish that good. $4 per pound of metal. Each Doggerific in finished goods inventory will have 1 pound of metal put into it, which is going to increase its inventoriable costs up to $4. Direct manufacturing labor. We would have inventoried the cost of labor at a rate of $10 per hour, and each of those units of Doggerifics we have in finished goods inventory would have required us to use 5 labor hours to put them together. It's a total of $50 worth of labor costs. It would be inventoried into each and every Dogorific we have an ending finished goods inventory at a rate of $105 per setup hour, knowing that each Dogorific causes us to incur on average about 0.19 setup hours to get the machines ready. That is a rate of $20.42 for each Dogorific. For processing at a rate of $10 per machine hour and having each one take 19 hours to machine. It means our processing cost for each Dogorific we have an ending finished goods inventory is $190. And for inspection at a rate of $15 per hour and having it take 0.08 hours to inspect one Dogorific means that each Dogorific we have an ending finished goods inventory causes us to incur $1.17 in overhead costs because we had to inspect it. And if I add all of these together, I find the sum of the 6 cost components, the 6 different types of inventoriable costs that we have for that particular model. We've determined that a Dogorific in ending finished goods inventory will have cost us $295.58 a piece. Which means those 10 Dogorifics that we are proposing to have in our ending finished goods inventory at the end of April 20XX, with each one causing us to incur $295.58 worth of cost, is going to be a total of $2,955.83 worth of costs, which are being inventoried in finished but yet unsold Dogorifics at the end of the period. And between our 2 different models, we are going to have $8,013.83 worth of costs inventoried in finished goods. And if I add our ending direct materials inventory to our ending finished goods inventory, I find that Animal Gear is going to have $10,323.83 in total ending inventory at the end of April 20XX. That was the last hard budget. Now we're moving on to the cost of goods sold budget. And for the cost of goods sold budget, we're going to use the same process that you've seen before. If you take what you had in the beginning, you add to it your additions, the cost that we paid to manufacture goods, you get the total amount of cost that went into goods that you could have sold. If you subtract out what you didn't sell from what you could have sold, you get the difference, which is what you actually sold. So let's start filling in some numbers. Beginning finished goods inventory on 4/1. I need to go find that information. So I go to our info over here. What was the cost that we had in beginning finished goods inventory? Well, we had $1,000 worth of Cadillacs in our beginning inventory, and we also had $4,650 worth of Dogorifics. I add those 2 together, we had $5,650 worth of cost committed to units which were finished but yet unsold when the month of April began. To that, we spent a whole ton of money manufacturing pet carriers during this month. How much did we spend? Well, we spent some money on direct materials. What was that? I can go to the direct material, very important, usage budget, because you can only record what you actually use under cost of goods sold. Not everything you purchased, only your actual usage. So I'm going to go to the direct materials usage budget, and I'm going to see here that we are proposing that we're going to use $19,033 worth of direct materials during the period. What about direct labor? What amount of direct labor went into goods which we manufactured during the period? Well, we got a direct labor budget. So if I go to the direct labor budget, I see that we're going to propose to spend $27,300 on units which we produced during the period for labor, and I bring that over. And then lastly, manufacturing overhead. I go to my manufacturing overhead budget, and way up at the top, the total manufacturing overhead costs that Animal Gear Company is expecting to incur during the period are $109,832. Since those are our 3 inventorial cost components, if we add them together, we see that the cost of units which we manufactured during the period in total was $156,165. If we add together the cost of units which we had which were finished when the period began, plus the cost of units that we had we paid during the period to finish even more units, we come up with a total of $161,815. That is the total cost that went into goods that were available for us to sell. But we didn't sell all of those. because we have ending finished goods, not all inventory, ending finished goods inventory on April 30th. I'm going to make this negative, so equals negative. And then I'm going to go over to my ending inventory budget and see that the costs that we have for finished goods, now again, not total inventory, just ending finished goods, was $8,013.83. I'm going to bring that over. I'm going to let Excel round it off to $8,014. That's fine with me. We could have sold $161,815, but we have $8,014 rounded off of finished goods inventory in our wares at the end of the period. So what amount did we actually sell? Animal Gear Company actually sold $153,801 worth of inventory during the period, or at least as we're proposing in our cost of goods sold budget.